Today is June 12th, 2021, and the Tucson Astrologers Guild is proud to present Georgia Stathis today. She will be talking about the importance of synodic cycles. What phase is it anyway, and how do I fit in? Looking forward to hearing her perspectives on the synodic phases. Georgia, you can go to her website, www.starcycles.com, to find out more about Georgia. I'm sure she'll say something about her, what she's doing. What she's doing with alexandriaibase.org is also very interesting. And you all have read the flyer and the MailChimp email, so I won't spend any more time. We know Georgia is as an active teacher for Kepler College, and we're so honored to have you present today, Georgia. So let's give her a hand and welcome Georgia.
Thank you. Shall I share the screen?
Go right ahead.
Okay, let's make sure we're getting the right screen, and let me start the slides. Okay, are you seeing one screen or are you seeing two? You're seeing one.
We're
right?
not seeing any. We're only seeing you right now.
Oh, okay. Well, then hold on. There's a little bit of a, okay, it must be this one then. Share this one from the beginning.
We're seeing your your computer. There you go. Good. No, we're seeing two screens.
You're seeing two screens. Okay, hold on. We will find the right one here because I'm on two monitors here. Okay, let's, I don't want to see that one. I do want to see this one. One screen?
One screen. Very good.
Got it. Okay, great. Yeah, I just started working with two monitors after like 40 years of work, and I like them, but when you do a presentation, you have to have, So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to your organization today. My name is Georgia Stathis. I've been a professional astrologer since the early 70s. And the lecture I'm doing today, lecture workshop, whatever you'd like to call it, is the result of about 30 years of research for the book that I wrote on synodic cycles. Came out about 3 years ago now. And I've always been interested in these, the conjoining of two planets when they trigger a new cycle. And there's a few things before we start. When I talk today about the synodic cycles, I'm going to be basically talking about the transit to transit phases of these cycles and focusing on some of the ones that are happening now, one of the ones that's happening now, and the one that's coming up in the spring with Jupiter, Neptune, and talking about others. But first, before we move through that, get to that, I'd like to just, cover a few items here. Let me see if I can move this to the next screen. Okay, next screen. If it's going to move there. Can you see that? Is it coming through okay? Yes? Okay. So I work with all kinds of techniques. I love technique. I wish more people would be teaching more precise technique. There's a very little time though, and we could do things like ingress charts and planetary ingresses. We could do rulerships, progressions, solar arcs, nodal returns, which, by the way, not to get too sidetracked here, but the last time the eclipses that just happened in May and on Thursday did happen exactly on the same dates in 2002, May and June, and they also happened on the same dates in May and June of 1983. If somebody wants to do a little tracking in terms of how their life has developed, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. I'm going to be doing a workshop on eclipses later this year. I work with Antisha. I love solar arcs, but today's lecture is focusing on synodic cycles. And there's a few points that have to be made before we start. I am going to, because I'm not sure if your organization has new people, intermediate people, advanced people. It looks like it's a cross section. So I am going to, in the first part of this class, go through the phases quickly of the moon, because when I did my research on synodic cycles, I actually used the eighth harmonic, which is the 8 phases, 45 degrees apart, which is the moon cycle also, to determine when the cycle phases were changing. And so that's kind of where I want to start, because if we just talk about a new moon, a lunar cycle each month at the conjunction, a new cycle begins every 29 days, 12 hours and 44 minutes. And we also know as astrologers that whenever there is a new moon, which happens every month, that the effects of that moon for that particular place in the horoscope and the aspects it is creating only last about for that month. I often feel that they kind of trigger the whole year, but specifically for that month. And the key being that the new phase is always the seed state of a cycle. By the time the cycle finishes, of course, things have changed. When I worked with this, I worked with the slower planets, and the slower the planets and their rare conjunctions are called synodic cycles, when they come together every so many years, triggering a brand new cycle. And the slower ones that come together, and we had a slow one, a fairly slow one last year, Saturn, Pluto, which is about 33 to 38 years, come around only every 33 to 38 years. So in maybe a lifetime, we'll see 2, possibly 3 of those returns. Once any of the 2 planets conjoin, they do create a brand new phase. And what they will do, they will continue their relationship to each other during the entire time of the cycle. And one of the things I want to make very clear here today, when I wrote synodic cycles, what I did, which is, I think, something that I found when I was doing the research, is I actually did, and you will see the drawings as we go a little further in. What I did is I drew a template of when the conjunction of Saturn, Pluto, or Jupiter, Saturn, or Uranus, Pluto occurred. And then I marked it off from that position every 45 degrees. And then what I did, I looked at, which is a little different than we read them when we're looking at transits to transits, I looked at the relationship of the faster of the 2 as it moved away from the conjunction through the cycle. And as that faster planet of the 2 crossed over into each one of the 8th harmonic phases, and I noticed specifically on dates when things were happening in the world. And I found that in many ways, the transit of the faster planet to the original conjunction of the 2 is often a preview at the movies of what we will see when we start to see the transit to transit relationship. And I mean, it's a lot more complicated than this, but I just wanted to be very clear today when I speak about the phases, I'm basically speaking about the transit to transit relationship that we're in, for example, right now with Saturn moving into a last quarter or closing square to Uranus. That's different than transiting Saturn to the original position of the Saturn-Uranus, which conjoined in 1988 at 29 degrees of Sagittarius. So today it's transit to transit, but I do look at both. And so I wanted to make that clear before we move through this presentation. And of course, the slower the planets, this is kind of a joke, but it's true. And when I work with my clients, I say, you know, the slower planets are always going to be the ones that win because they hang out in a part of the horoscope a lot longer. So with that said, I do know, many of you know the cycle, but I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, that, you know, any cycle has a waxing cycle when it's growing on the left on your screen from 0 to 180 degrees, which is, you see the new on the top to the full moon at the bottom. And then, of course, the waning is the separating cycle, which is the dying on the vine cycle. And I just wanted to show this to you. Some of this have read my business astrology book or seen this in lectures, but I think it's important to kind of look at this. It's kind of, when I saw this for the first time, I thought, oh my gosh, that's why I want to use this. When you look at the 8th harmonic, which is, you know, 8 divided into 360, gives you 45 degrees in each section. If you look at these degrees, for the 45 degree, it adds up to 9. For the 90 degree, which is the first quarter opening square of any cycle, it adds up to 9. For the gibbous phase, which is when the cycle is still growing, 135 degrees, it adds up to a 9. if you look at 180 degrees, which is when we see a full moon, when the Earth is between the sun and the moon, or when two planets are in opposition to each other, that's a 9. 1 plus 8 plus 0 is 9. Of course, the little arrow is hiding this here, but it's 225 in the disseminating phase, which adds up to a 9. 270 adds up to a 9. That's the closing square, which we're in right now with Saturn to square to Uranus. And then the balsamic seed state is 315 degrees, which adds up to a 9. And this is important. And then, of course, you can go to 360, which adds up to a 9. And then we start at 0. This is important. This is what kind of got me looking at this, because the number 9 in numerology, for those of you who use numerology, is the number out of the 9 numbers, 1 through 9, that will always give itself up to all the other numbers. You can add up huge amounts of numbers by hand and just cross out all the 9s because they don't matter. And the 9 from a numerological perspective, it's the letting go, it's the ending of a cycle, it's the transition. And it's also related to the 9th card in the Tarot, which is the Hermit, which has a different perspective for all people who look at that card. I mean, here's in the Rider-Waite deck, you see this Jesuit, I think he's a Jesuit priest in robes, burlap, carrying a lantern. And from two perspectives, one could be, well, he's walking away from the viewer. And from another perspective, he's lighting the way into the dark for the viewer. And so this is why when these planets, the faster of the two planets is moving over any of these phases, we see a change of some sort. And that's about as simplistic as I can make this. I want to move through the phases fairly quickly so we can start talking about the cycles. Obviously, the new phase happens between, we're not talking the lunar, we're talking for any synodic cycle. For example, last December, we had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0 Aquarius, 29 minutes. And that means that Jupiter, the faster of the two planets, is still moving through the new phase until it hits 45 degrees away from the original position, or when they become 45 degrees away from each other. And the new phase, a lot of people say, and I've been doing this a long time, as many of you, a lot of people say, we start projects on new moons, which I do believe it's good to start a lot of projects on new moons. But after working for this, or a new cycle, after working with this for a while, I think since the new is a very non-experienced part of the cycle, I mean, there's no experience. You walk off the cliff, oh, that's an adventure. Ignorance in many ways is very much blissful during this time. We try a lot of new things. We try pioneering new ideas, which are not yet developed. We get a lot of insight that, oh, this is possible, or this is possible. And when I show you some of the, I'll show you the Jupiter-Saturn chart and show you some of the things that we've encountered since December. It's the new part. It's non-experienced. I think that's very important. And when there's no experience, we make a lot of mistakes, or because we haven't addressed things prior to the cycle, we start to realize what the mistakes are and we have to fix them. The next phase is one of the harder phases. It's the crescent phase, which always appears between 45 and 90 degrees, when the faster of the two planets is moving in a waxing phase. This is hard, this cycle, because this is where you have to gather information to see if that new idea that came in during the synodic, during the conjunction, is even viable. And this is where you have to really go through all the red tape. You have to see if it's possible. You do your research, see what else is doing. And this is, because I do believe that these synodic cycles of these, larger planets, when they come together, trigger trends. And that's what I love to do, is I love to look at trends, looking at historical trends and going forward in the future. And so lots of new trends are starting with a lot of these conjunctions in the last year. But there's a lot of mistakes, and there's a lot of errors and a lot of things we didn't take care of. And so if somebody wants to really move into a new phase for their work or their business, you're going to have to do the work. This is where you do the research. Anybody else doing it? Are there other resources for this? And if you can get through this, phase, then and only then, when we begin to move into the first quarter phase, which is from 90 to 135 degrees, which is also called the opening square. Now and only now, it's when we have peripheral vision. Between the 0 degree and the 90 degrees, you're driving with a blind spot, like in a car if you drive. And, you know, and then all of a sudden you see people on either side of you and, oh, I see it. Okay. And in a way you can look at the driver as the 0 position here. And here's the blind spot, which is starting to be open. And this is when you begin to see my idea, the trend, whatever is viable. And this is what I call the organizational management cycle, is the first quarter phase. And you can use these ideas even with your clients, when they're looking at the progressed moon or whatever. But in terms of larger trends, this is when the ideas now can be organized, they're viable, and they're moving forward. As we move into the gibbous phase, which is, it's an old term, standing on the soapbox, to tell people, oh, you've discovered this and I want to tell you about it. That's about 135 degrees to 180. We're still in the waxing. I always remembered that because waxing, the candle burns, and you get all this wax on the candle and it grows. That's how I always remembered waxing. And then waning, of course, you break all that wax off the candle. But the gibbous phase is the declaration of the belief of something you've discovered, the declaration of discovery. As we move into the full moon phase, which is, of course, the furthest away that you can get in a circle, 180 degrees is as far as you can get away in a circle. And yes, the next phase is 225, but obviously it's smaller if we reduce that down. So here in this phase is when something has to go. I call this the rubber band phase, where what is not viable, what we found out over the course of the first part of the cycle, has to go to move on. And, it's very interesting in terms of transit to transit, and I don't want to bring this up today, but on 9/11, many of you know, transiting Saturn was in an opposition to transiting Pluto. They were opposing each other. And of course, we know what happened, and the rubber band broke. Or it doesn't have to break. I mean, you can also make a conscious decision to get rid of something to make life a little bit easier. Then we move into the disseminating phase, which is the sharing. It's disseminating. You're sharing information. You've cleaned up the act. You're sharing information. You're selling something that is really pretty workable and good, and it's fantastic. And, depending on, and this is extremely important to remember, that every synodic cycle has a different length. So, for example, if we're looking at a Jupiter-Mars conjunction, that happens every 2.25 years. That's going to be quick and dirty. By about the 2 years and some change period, you're making a change. And by the time the next 2.25 comes along, you're going to be at the conjunction. But if you're looking at something bigger, like the Saturn-Pluto, which we're still in, that is a long cycle. I mean, that's about a 38-year cycle. So these phases will be longer when you're looking at the slower cycles. And that's an important thing to remember as well, which is obvious, but I just think it's important to mention it. Now I want to talk a lot about this today. The last quarter phase, which is also called the closing square, I found in all my research, regardless of a cycle, even in the monthly lunar cycle, this is the hardest part of the cycle, believe it or not. You might think the crescent phase is the hard part, but at least in the crescent phase, when you're finding out if something's viable, it hasn't established itself for very long, and you can decide, I'm going to keep it or I'm not. When you've gotten over here to the closing phase, the last quarter phase, it is a sense of loss. I can't see the future. You can't go back. You can't go back because 3/4 of the way is back, and you only have 1/4 of the way to go. And so what I found in all my research, that this cycle, regardless of which synodic cycle you're looking at, is when you get re-educated, you learn something absolutely out of the box or new, or something you've been thinking about that may have nothing to do with what you do professionally or personally, but it's always been of interest. And what I found is that learning that something is the key to the future. And every single time people, and it's very interesting because, and I will be talking more about this when we talk about Saturn, Uranus, everybody in the world, who has access has been learning how to virtually communicate, whether they like it or not, in the last 1.5 years with these last quarter phases that are moving through. And then, of course, we have the last phase of the cycle. Oh, yeah, I wanted to make sure I put that in there so you see it. The last phase of the cycle is the balsamic phase, which many people don't think that's very important. It's like balsamic vinegar, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the best vinegar because it's been in the barrel the longest, right? It's had a chance, its fermentation time. And I found when I was doing the research that everything that we think starts on the new cycle really starts in the balsamic phase. You just don't see it. And it's interesting not to do too much of a sidetrack here, just to give you one example of a person that was born with a balsamic Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which is the innovation cycle, is Stephen Jobs of Apple Computer. Jupiter was behind his Uranus. It was about to conjoin. And, you know, if you look at his chart, and I have an example of that in the Synodic book about Apple and all the developments, everything happened for them in the balsamic phases. It's very interesting. So, you know, let's think about this. Last year, we had all those horrible conjunctions. Jupiter-Pluto, Saturn-Pluto, Jupiter-Saturn, all on the south node, you know, like the teeter-totter, where the seesaw was out of balance. But in the year prior, in 2019, all that time and through part of 2020, those cycles were all in the balsamic phases. And there was all that crazy dying on the vine, lots of new ideas, things changing massively. And so, you know, these are the things that I noticed, little things as I went through the research. And I just wanted to make sure I shared that with you. Now, briefly, I don't have all of them on here. Synodic measurements in years. So obviously the Jupiter-Mars conjunction is only 2.25 years. Wherever it happens in the horoscope is where there's a new motivation to begin. And before I go any further, whenever I look at any of these conjunctions and where they take place in either a natal chart or a business chart or a mundane chart, I always, even in my readings, when I'm looking at transits or progressions, I always make sure that I include the houses that those planets rule. Because if you don't include the houses that those planets rule, you will not get the full picture. Jupiter-Mars is the motivation to expand. Every 2.25 years, it takes place in a different part of a horoscope. Jupiter-Neptune is extremely important because that is coming up next year, April 12th, 2022. It is a cycle of vision, which is currently in its balsamic phase because it's not there yet. And it is also a cycle of inflation. And if anybody has read the news in the last few days, if you read the news, I read it as frequently as I can, there's a huge inflation right now because of the supply-demand limitation. I also think Neptune has a great deal to do with debt. And I will be talking about Jupiter-Neptune further on in our presentation. But it has a lot to do with vision. And I want to make sure we think positive as well as, you know, the challenging part of it. The Jupiter-Pluto is about almost a 13-year cycle. We had that last year at 23 or 25 Capricorn. Can be great fortune, and it can also be great revelations, things coming to the surface that need to be revealed. I've not read that anywhere, but I've seen a lot of, you know, like the Harvey Weinstein situation. That was very Jupiter-Pluto. I think he was born with Jupiter-Pluto. The Jupiter-Uranus cycle is almost 14 years. It's the innovation cycle. The Jupiter-Saturn, which we started again last December 2020, is the elimination of the unimportant. That's about almost a 20-year cycle. The Saturn-Pluto is really 33 to 38 years. I should have corrected that. It's a typo, sorry. And the reason we do that is because, you know, Pluto has a very elliptical orbit. So, you know, sometimes they'll be quick and sometimes they won't be so quick. And, you know, as a side note, you know, and this could be another lecture, because Pluto over the last, since 1937, has had 7 ingresses into a different sign out of 12. This means that the people that were born in the 1930s are having, for the first time in our modern history, their Pluto oppositions. Which is a very interesting thing. I've been doing some work with that right now, looking at, you know, the older anarchists, shall we say, that are changing things. But there's several people that are having their Pluto oppositions now, which we didn't see. I mean, in our lifetime since 1937, we've seen 7. If we live a few more years, we'll probably see 8 or 9 ingresses of Pluto. And I want to also make sure that I mention that. Look at Scorpio in the horoscope, because every time Pluto changes signs, the condition of the house that Scorpio is in will change. And this is why our money is changing and currency is changing and all kinds of things are changing. Anyway, moving on. Now the Saturn-Neptune conjunction is a little longer, not as quite as long as Saturn-Pluto. That's about 36 to 37 years, and that is coming up again on February 20th of 2026 at 0 degrees of Aries. That should be interesting. And I found in my research, a lot of people go, oh God, Saturn, Neptune. Yeah, I found a lot of oil leaks, environmental disasters with oil on Saturn, Neptune. But it is also in the research I did, since Neptune has to do with the art world and music is one of the pieces of art, that every time Saturn, Neptune conjoined, we saw the form, Saturn, of music completely changed. Blues, rock and roll. It's fascinating, and that's the part of that chapter that I did in the book. And of course, we're still in, and will be until 2032. We are still in the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, which is about a 45 plus year cycle. The last time it occurred was 1988 at almost the galactic center at 29 degrees of Sag, 55 minutes, and we're still in it. And because that is, and it's interesting because 45 is what? 45 is when Saturn opposes Saturn. And this means that about every 30 years, when Saturn goes over the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, which it did do on December 20th of 2017, that there's some things that have to be fixed or changed until the cycle finishes. And I'm going to be showing you some examples of that today. And of course, the Uranus-Neptune conjunction is a really long cycle. It's almost 172 years. I'm going to talk briefly about that today. In 1993, it was at 19 degrees of Capricorn, 33 minutes. And it's very much when borders and boundaries dissolve on so many levels. And of course, the biggie, Neptune-Pluto conjunction is 493 years. And that last occurred in 1891 to 1892. And that's fascinating to watch, to see the people that were born during that period. Amazing inventors, minds that brought things into the modern day. So any questions before I go and talk about the Jupiter-Saturn? Anybody in chat wants to clarify something or get a date that they missed, or shall I move on? I'm not watching it, so I'll just trust that we'll move on.
I don't think there's any questions so far. No.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this is a page from Pushing Through Time, which is the name of the book. And this is what I was trying to explain to you a little earlier. What I have several pages in the back of the book showing the past conjunctions, because I like to research and I like a quick and dirty way to do this. So this is really more for me, but it's also for people reading this. So this is a page, February 18th of 1961, we had a conjunction of the two at 25 degrees of Capricorn, 12 minutes. And what I did here, and this is what I alluded to at the beginning of our lecture today, is that I did what happened when, Jupiter and Saturn conjoined, which is the faster of the two planets. It's Jupiter, obviously, because Jupiter's 12 years and Saturn's, 29 and a half. So what I did with this is I actually, and it's hard to see and I apologize, but I put the conjunction here, 25 Capricorn, 12 minutes. And then what I did is I moved Jupiter forward by transit. So on this particular example, on May 23rd, 1962, Jupiter moved into the crescent phase to the original conjunction. On March 23rd of 1964, I don't know where my arrow is, here it is, it moved to the first quarter phase. I have the dates all the way around. And since Jupiter-Saturn is almost 20 years, Jupiter is going to come back to this position 12 years later, which happened on February 1st of 1973. Those are the ones in the parentheses when it comes back. The next one happened April 24th, 74, March 4th, 1976. And then whenever it stops, we go to the next one in 1980. And I want to mention this one in 1980. It was at 9 degrees of Libra, 29 minutes. And, everybody's been talking a lot about Jupiter Saturn this last year, about how it's starting this new 200-year air cycle. The truth, however, I think, is it really did start the cycle in 1980 when it was at 9 Libra. I think that was kind of a preview at the movies. I just, wanted to make sure I mentioned that, because now we do know, since Jupiter conjoined Saturn in December at 0 Aquarius 29 minutes, that we're starting into a new 200-year, mostly air element. Very different than the last 200 years of where it's been in an earth element. And I just, for those of you who, have a lot of research time and nothing else to do, I thought you might like to know December 2nd, 2032 is when Jupiter returns to the original conjunction of 0 Aquarius 29 minutes. Meanings for Jupiter Saturn: elimination of the unimportant. Why? Well, because Jupiter is about, well, let's do this, let's do that, let's do this. Saturn comes along and says, nice idea, but it's not all going to work. And that's what happens with Jupiter Saturn. It's the end of indulgence, Jupiter Saturn. It's definitely a check and balance period in business, which we obviously saw. Focusing is possible with Saturn, and I don't think Saturn's a bad planet. I think if we didn't have Saturn, we'd really be a mess. We need Saturn because Saturn keeps us, I don't know if it keeps us honest, but it keeps us on the ground. It's a Jupiter expanding responsibly, Saturn. And it's also, and I need to say this, I think since Saturn really traditionally is the karma, I think it's the karma of irresponsibility, as well as the karma of responsibility. And I think that's important for us to remember, because Saturn is involved in this conjunction. And this is what I wanted to look at. I did a chart, and I did it for Greenwich, and I did it for when the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction occurred in Greenwich, because that's kind of what we use as a base. I mean, you can do it for wherever you live, but I did this, and I think it's actually showing up pretty vividly in the news right now, for December 21st, 2020 at 6:18 p.m. Where the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction took place in this chart was in the 6th house, which is a Virgo house in the natural zodiac. And, Virgo, think about it. Virgo is the small intestine in the body, which decides this is good and this is bad. This is good, this is bad. This database needs cleaning up. This database is a mess. It's not exactly the most fun house of the chart, but it's an important, and it has a lot to do with processing and processing services and food reserves. We have a lot now going on about food insecurity, policing methods, which are getting checked, revealed. Armed forces is the 6th house, systems management, widespread databases, international databases, which I think is happening more and more as we move on. Health, medicine, the efficiency of all of it, and how we connect. The key thing to look at here, and I did mention this last year when I was looking at this, is that Pluto, at the time of this conjunction, was at almost 24 degrees of Capricorn, which is, by the way, interesting, because when it goes direct October 6th of this year, we'll go direct to 24 Capricorn, 18 minutes right on this Pluto. So here's Pluto about 7 degrees behind Jupiter and Saturn. And the one thing I did bring up in the lectures I've been giving is that we were going to see a lot of threats with cybersecurity, with databases and ransomware. I mean, I actually was talking about this last year. And of course, if you've seen the news in this last couple of weeks of all the heists and the breaks, and FBI found a bunch of people and arrested them, and people being held hostage for ransomware. I mean, this has to be cleaned up. They were talking last week about they may not allow companies to pay ransom, but I don't know how they're going to do that. But this is also an industry that could be very good, because for cybersecurity, just one way to look at it. And of course, if we look at Pluto as one of the rulers of money and banking, is Bitcoin really a good choice? And I've done actually a lecture on that, but we're not going to do that today. So, but I want to talk extensively today about where Saturn Uranus is, because here we are. Today is June 12th, 2 days more, we're going to have the second Saturn-Uranus closing square, last quarter square between Saturn and Uranus. We will have the next one on December 24th of 2021. And what people are not looking at, I am very surprised, is that October of 2022, Saturn and Uranus will be at 18 degrees fixed for about a week and a half to 2 weeks. They won't be square by minute, but they will be square by degree. And I don't think that we're going to see the last of the Saturn closing square to Uranus after the December 24th date. I think we really have to look at October of next year, because next year, the North and South node will be in Taurus and Scorpio. Uranus will be on the North node. Saturn will be squaring those nodes. And the Saturn square Uranus will be at 18 degrees for almost 2 weeks. And I think it'll be very interesting to watch the markets. I want to talk about that in a minute. But first, Saturn Uranus, Saturn is, let's look at it as the difficult, where there's an issue, where there's restriction, where we can't seem to get it together in terms of, say, business or life. And Uranus is the out of the box thinker that is a rebel. It's going to do its own thing. I actually had Catherine DeJersey. I don't know how many of you knew her. She was an astrologer in Chicago, and she used to call Uranus, which I think she's right, is the sign of the big dealers. And I always looked at Uranus as wholesale versus retail. You can work for an hour like I'm working with you with 30 people, or I can work for an hour with one person, still the same amount of time, Saturn, but it's thinking out of the box so that you reach a larger audience. So Uranus has a lot to do with large networks, invention, science. And this is in the book, but I just thought it would be fun to look at this, a sampling of what happened after certain Saturn-Uranus conjunctions. In 1897, which was, right around the time of that big Neptune-Pluto thing as well, we had a conjunction at 27 Scorpio, 39 minutes. We had the cathode ray came in at the time, at the new phase. The kinescope came in around 1929. And in 1933, which was the last quarter phase between Saturn and Uranus, Franklin Delano Roosevelt began his fireside chats, comparable to today's podcasts. It's the same thing. It's just a different name, right? 1942, Saturn-Uranus conjunction, and Uranus is networks. 29 Taurus going into Gemini very quickly, which is children. So in 58, we had the first U.S., it was during this cycle, the first U.S. children's TV show, which was I have the little phases marked. That was at the first quarter phase. 1953, the first color television came out, RCA. That was at the gibbous phase. 56, the first remote control, disseminating information, you didn't have to get up anymore. You just changed it on your remote. That was in a disseminating, the full phase. 1964 was the first plasma display in the closing square. 1964, Marshall McLuhan wrote a book called Understanding Media, The Extension of Man. And at the time, this is back in 1964, he called it the global village. 30 years later, from 1964 going forward to 1994, when Saturn went over the conjunction, his book was again released. We talked about the global village. And I just thought this would be a very important thing to think about, because all these cycles, a lot of us are really down now. A lot of clients are down. What's going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen. That's because we're in the last quarter phase of Saturn to Uranus. It's not a good place to be, but it's also a juicy place to be if you can use your imagination. So whenever you have a synodic cycle and two planets come together, it's like chemistry. I loved chemistry. It was my favorite topic in school, where, you had all the periodic table of elements. Na was sodium and Cl was chloride, and you put those together and you get salt. Well, it's the same way with synodic cycles and planets. You have Saturn, which has a certain chemical energy, and Uranus has a separate chemical energy, and you bring them together and they form this whole new thing. So during and after World War II, when we had the Saturn-Uranus conjunction at 29 degrees of Taurus in 1942, after that time, as soon as it quickly moved into Gemini and the war was over, we started building the national highway system. Gemini, third house, people got cars and they wanted to travel. And Uranus is the big dealers, the networks, the connections, if you will. And Saturn is construction. And the interesting thing about that, there was a big building boom of, the ticky-tacky houses. It's in San Francisco. There's a song that was actually written about that during the post-war time after that Saturn-Uranus conjunction, because, and this is another thing I look at when I look at a client's chart, or I look at transits, or I look at the synodics. Yeah, Saturn-Uranus was at 29 degrees of Taurus in 20 minutes, but it was in the last 10 degrees, which is the Capricorn section, which is the builder. And this is another piece that gives you information. If you look at the decadence, and I do look at the decadence, I don't do a lot with dwads. I've looked at them, but I do pay attention. If I look at somebody's rising sign that's, 25 Capricorn, say, for example, I know that's in the Virgo section. So when I look at their chart, yes, I'm going to look at Saturn, but I'm also going to look to see where Mercury is in the chart as well, because the decadents, I think, tell us a lot about personality. So this happened in 1942. 45 years later, because it's a 45-year cycle, Saturn-Uranus came together at 29 Sag, 55 minutes. Now, instead of national highways, we were morphing new chemicals into information highways. And this is when, in the late 80s, I know it's also when Glasnost happened and, the Soviet Union broke up, but I know those who have been in astrology for a while know that the personal computers start to become very available and very quickly adapted after the Saturn-Uranus. They were there before in the late 70s, but more adaptability after. And of course, one of the things that I do want to mention, and I'm going to mention it in a minute, is anytime you have hard angles between Saturn and Uranus, especially now that the stock market and the markets are on computers with algorithms, you're going to have some crazy stuff happening. Because this is also the era when the high frequency trading began. And one of the comments I wanted to make, if you have a lot of time and nothing else to do, is to watch when transit Neptune goes to 29 degrees of Pisces, which is going to happen somewhere around 2025. And it's squaring this position, because I think we're going to see some very new kinds of markets, if you will. So this is the thing I wanted to talk about earlier. This is the Saturn-Uranus conjunction of 1988, which we're still in. And of course, what you're seeing is my take on transit Saturn being the faster one here as it moved away from the original position. This is the transit to the original position. Put that aside. When transit Saturn from 1988 traveled all the way around and came back to 29 Sag, 55 minutes, that was in late December of 2017. This is the same week that Ajit Pai led a vote to deny net neutrality. We're talking about, information highways, and several states sued. Saturn crossed this point. There was a big hubbub about it, and it's still an issue. This is also December 22, 2017 at 11:22 a.m. when Saturn crossed this point, and President number 45, I won't mention his name, signed in the new tax law that happened at Saturn on that conjunction. And we started seeing, some very strange market fluctuations. We saw a flash crash May 6th of 2010. And actually, if I had more time, I would love to do research on flash crashes when they happen, because they only happen for a few minutes. But what happens with a flash crash, because a lot of these larger companies are on, networks where they built in this trading algorithm. And sometimes what happens, it goes crazy. And for 1 or 2 minutes, people will lose millions and gain millions. And they have to shut the market down. And so, this is some of the stuff that, the same thing with cybersecurity idea. We need to, pay attention to that and make sure we have really good firewalls in our computers. Now, I don't know why this next one is blank. That's kind of strange. Okay, so the last quarter square is the breaking down of structures. And what I have here is a drawing. Uranus is the slower of the planet of the two, of Saturn, Uranus. Uranus is here at this position. So Saturn is still here in the last quarter square. And my question to you as individuals, first of all, if you were around in 1988, Or if you were around in 1942, look at where Saturn and Uranus occurred in your horoscope. What were the houses that Saturn and Uranus ruled? What changes happened when it happened again in 1988? And now it's not, the next one's not happening until 2032, the next conjunction, but we are in the last quarter phase of the old cycle. So what is it right now in terms of your life structure, in terms of your work structure, that isn't working, that needs to have some new education, so that it can be successful or see the forest for the trees, the light, when you get to the 2032 28-degree Gemini 01. I do know last year when we were having all these terrible pandemic, that the unfortunate thing was our youth couldn't go to school. I mean, they could go to school if they had access, but there were a lot of people that didn't have access. And of course, because the schools had to shut down, nobody was prepared. The teachers were caught with their pants down, literally. They couldn't figure out what to do, and they were, sort of patching things together. My view of that catastrophe that happened last year is that's actually the breeding ground, the fermenting ground, especially is when Saturn and Uranus move into the balsamic phase, that when the 2032 shows up and it's at 28 degrees of Gemini, that we'll have that locked down in terms of how to teach online, in person, hybrid, both, firewalls, training programs. And I even think what we're going to have by 2032 is actually three-dimensional. You walk into a classroom and it's a three-dimensional room, very much like, it's virtual reality, where you can walk into a painting, which I've done. I mean, when I was at my home in St. Petersburg a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, it's a good story, and I think that this is the future. There's a place there called the Dali Museum, which I love, and they were doing an exhibit of Walt Disney, who did a film with Salvador Dali, a very short film, and it was a fascinating exhibit. And in the last room, this is about 2 years ago, in the last room, they had goggles, virtual reality, and one person at a time. You went in, you put on the goggles, and you literally walked through a Salvador Dali painting. And it was amazing to see clocks dripping, elephants walking. We're in the middle of this painting, and I thought, oh my God, wouldn't that be cool with astrology? To walk into the horoscope. I know I sound like I'm really crazy and maybe out there, but I think by 2032, when those two come together, we're going to see more and more of that in our industries, which will make it, I mean, they're already doing things with avatars, but I think it'll be a little bit more sophisticated. Okay, so let's talk a little bit history here. Let's talk about some of the I'm not going to do a lot of time on this, but the past dates of the last quarter squares between Saturn and Uranus, which always means a breakdown of something. It's always a breakdown. Quickly, December 3rd of 1839 to October 10th of 1840, there was a major panic in the markets, started in 1837. Profits and prices were down. Unemployment was high. Does that sound familiar? The wheat crops failed. Interesting, because I see a lot of weather problems during the Saturn square Uranus. Uranus is wind, Saturn is dry. Uranus was in Pisces at the time, and Saturn was in Sag. So since this is a 45-year cycle, any phase that you're researching, if you want to do research for this cycle, you just want to add 45 years to it, because it's a 45-year cycle, which takes us to June 18th, 1885 to April 29th, 1886. The gold reserves dropped severely. The market crashed again, and we were in the tail end of the Civil War reconstruction. Add 45 years to that, and there's the 1930s. February 22 to 30 to October 31, the crash of 1929 triggered this. The Dust Bowl drove families away from their lands. And that's what I was saying a little earlier. I have found climate extreme. Uranus is extremes. Saturn is dry. Extreme climate issues, either extreme extreme wet or extreme dry. Hindenburg exploded. And because of all the craziness that was happening when FDR came into office, he started the New Deal and formed the SEC. Add 45 years to that. Some of us remember this. October 4th, 75 to April 22, 77, Vietnam ended after many protests. Nixon resigned in 74 after the Watergate scandal. Spiro Agnew was caught on bribery charges in 1974. And James Carter came into office for one office. And this is when the oil crisis began, because what happens when you get the Saturn closing square to Uranus, you see autocrats or tyrants popping up. And then there's major revolutions. And what happened in the late 70s, Khomeini, they kicked out the Shah of Iran. Khomeini came in. And then, of course, we had the problem with the oil, and they cut us off, and we were waiting on alternating days for our gas. Homelessness was finally surfacing a little bit later in the early 80s with the loss of a lot of the welfare programs that were started in the 1930s. Affordable housing programs. There was also an increasing threat of mental illness that was left unaddressed as Neptune moved through the last degrees of Sagittarius. And I do think that Neptune has a lot to do with the ecstatic experience and the idea of madness. And we have had in the last couple of years transiting Neptune, squaring the transiting nodes, which have been hitting our chart in the United States. Domestic abuse arose during this time. It became a rallying cry for new laws arising from the Saturn-Pluto in Libra, justice and fairness. And then you add 45 years to now. Okay. Here's some of the social programs that began in the 30s when Roosevelt came in, quite a few. And these are the dates. And interesting thing about what's happening now, I mean, we are in the last quarter square again, and all this money is being given for social programs. The thing that's interesting about these is every time we get to a new last quarter square, like we did in the late 70s and like we're doing again now, they don't last. They only last for a certain amount of time for the economy to get back on its feet. But then, of course, everybody has to pay for them. Interesting thing about the late 30s as well, Uranus was entering Taurus in 1934 as well, like it is now. And this is one of the autocrats that rose to power. It was Hitler. This is also interesting, I think, because we're talking about infrastructure, you know, breaking down now. In the late 30s, the PWA, the Public Works Administration, completed 11,428 road projects, 70% of the current school buildings. I mean, think about that. That's 90 years. A third of all the present day hospitals, and also the first federally financed housing. And this is a part of a map of what was being developed at that time by the PWA. This is the 1975, a little bit more about Carter. Autocrats in the world began to rise. Somoza's regime in Nicaragua came to an end after Carter found the extent of the brutality, and he ended it. And this, I talked about I talked about the Khomeini and the gas lines. And I wanted to show this for the people who are, you know, this is from Solar Fire. I have a little program called Snippet. Some of you may know what that is. It's free. When you're doing a presentation, this is just a quick and dirty teaching aid thing. You can look at your Solar Fire sheet and just put a snippet around it and use it as a JPEG in your presentations. But what I wanted to show you here is, yes, you know, Saturn square Uranus is a square. It's a square. It's 90 degrees. Saturn was in an opening, if I can get this, Saturn was in an opening square to Uranus in 1909, but in the last quarter square, which you can see here, Aries, Capricorn. Capricorn's behind Aries. So this is the last quarters here. These are the last quarters here, and these are the last quarters. And I know you know this, but for some of the beginning students, this is a thing, you know, well, it's still a square. Well, it's not the same square. It's a really different square. I actually think the opening square, you have more control. I think the last quarter square, you have to go on instinct. And I think that's the difference. The opening ones, you have control where you can see what you need to do. The closing squares are, well, I don't know what I'm doing, but I think I should do this. It's very different. It's a very different kind of energy. And infrastructure breaks down. I mean, here we have on the last cycle from the late 70s, the Teton Jam broke. We had 3 Mile Island in 79. The first closing square between Saturn and Uranus took place on Wednesday, February 17th this year. And 2 days before that happened, here's Texas. We all know what happened. Their infrastructure broke down. those poor people didn't have power because somebody was asleep at the wheel. And this is part of what I'm talking about, Saturn being karmic. If you didn't do your job, then you have to deal with it. And of course, I thought this was not fun, but this is exactly on the day of the first Saturn's closing square to Uranus this year. This is when they blew up the Trump Tower. I think it was on, they raised it. It was on, I think, the boardwalk in Atlantic City. It happened on the exact day of transit Saturn squaring Uranus for the first time. And talk about the late 70s. We had the Pinto. If you ran into a Pinto, it blew up. We had Love Canal. I mean, all these things happened during these last quarter squares. So, even though I'm not happy about it and we're very unsettled about it, it is part of the cycle. So now, looking at something going forward, the Saturn to Uranus challenge is the Global Positioning System, the GPS. The GPS system was started by the U.S. Department of Defense in '73. It was developed around the time Saturn was entering Gemini. The first prototype spacecraft was launched in '78. And, thank God for the GPS, because if we didn't have the GPS, we wouldn't have our cell phones, and we couldn't do this class. And people don't know how to add anymore, and they have cash registers, right? But one of the things that's coming up now, since this thing was developed on the last quarter, on the former last quarter square between Saturn and Uranus, is that from then to now, several countries, India, Russia have, and probably US too, have thrown their missiles, out into space, kind of like research missiles, and they blow them up and they leave them in space. And so what's happening now is all this space junk is all over the place. And if the space junk hits the GPS, we won't be able to do classes like this. We won't be able to use our cash registers, and we won't be able to use our cell phones. And I do think, and it's also about power grids too. So Space Force, which was started by the 45th president, it was considered to be another military, but I did hear an interview with the guy that was in charge of it, and I wish I had his name. I should look that up. They were interviewing, what are you going to do? What's your first job? And he says, our first job is to go out there and clean up the space junk, because we know that if something happens, we can't operate. And so, I am looking at this. I am a little concerned on these Saturn square Uranuses, or if Mars goes over these positions, or, we won't have eclipses on these positions now, but that we might have some sort of issues with this. So the thing I'm always telling people is learn your math again. It's very important. Okay, so Uranus is the air and the winds. So the difficulty that happened this last year, where people couldn't go anywhere because of the pandemic, is bringing in a lot of new opportunities for wind and air circulation. The thing that's interesting is if you have solar energy on your home or your business, I have that on my home. I thought naively when I did that when power goes down, because we get a lot of power failures here, that the solar power would maintain, and it will not. So I had to add a generator. So I think generators are big business right now, because we're going to be needing backups for power systems that fail. I think because of the pandemic, all kinds of new HVAC systems are being invented and being incorporated into hotels, into theaters. I think ultimately they'll be putting them in schools. It's a very new technology now, but it's a new industry. We know last Christmas or last holiday season that there was a huge influx of orders for home HEPA filters to clean the air, because Uranus is the air. And Saturn is about, oh, there's something wrong with the air, better fix it. Wind turbines, that kind of thing. And of course, we know what happened right on the first Saturn-Uranus square in February, the whole thing with GameStop, where, all these young kids got on and GameStop went up and then went down and went up and went down, and the market went crazy for a few days. And then the more traditional traders got in. This is something that we will be seeing. I don't know if we might see it for a day or two this year because of the Saturn closing square to Uranus. But again, I'm really looking at October of next year. There is an article I have by a gentleman, James Mars Langham, who used to write for American Astrology or Dell, written in the 30s regarding the eighth harmonic between Saturn and Uranus. Very good article. And he actually has each phase, he doesn't call it a phase, he has the degree distances and what happened, like a recession or whatever. And it's because Uranus is unpredictable. And Saturn tries to rein it in. And so when they get together in a hard angle to each other, Uranus is going to win because it's the slow planet and it wins. They're in conflict. And again, on the other side of that, you figure out a new way to do things because of those crises as well. You know, human beings are so weird. They don't do anything unless there's a crisis. Instead of saying, oh, I think a crisis is coming, I think I should fix this. And then you alleviate the explosions of Uranus. I was talking to somebody the other day saying, well, how can I prevent the chaos of Uranus in my life? And I think this is how you prevent it. Uranus is like a radio antenna. You're always getting an instinct that you need to do something. It's like an anxiety intuition. It could be called a red flag. It's like something you should be doing, but you ignore it, you put it down, and you put it down, and you put it down, and then it blows up in your face. And I've seen this in personal horoscopes. I've seen it in marriages, you know, many years ago, you know, they're not happy in their marriage. They don't know what to do. A magical person comes in. He or she is going to be the person that they were meant to be with. They leave their marriage and go with this person. Of course, that dies as soon as they leave their marriage. Instead of just saying, I'm not happy in my marriage, I need to do something about this and stay in or get out or fix it. It's the same thing with jobs. You see it all the time. Somebody has a feeling that they're not happy in their company, that they're just not working, but they're afraid. Saturn is fear. If I leave, I'm going to lose my security. And they don't leave. And then the company blows up and they have to get another job. I mean, Uranus is not necessarily chaotic if we listen to it. And if we can move past our fear and be more resourceful, because it is a resource. Saturn is a resourceful planet. It is the planet of survival. And again, this is the October 22, 2022 date, 18 degrees. Saturn and Uranus will be at 18 degrees fixed. It will last for 2 weeks. Uranus will be on the north node in Taurus, and Saturn will be squaring the nodes. There's a question? Okay, I'm going to keep going. Sounds like somebody's on asking the question. No, I guess nobody's on. Okay, so you.
Somebody
Again,
just came on, but need to mute. Somebody did just enter the Zoom,
okay.
and they need to mute themselves.
Okay, hold on. Let me get some water. I asked this to all of you earlier, but as a good teacher, I'm going to ask it again. What infrastructure in your life is not working for you right now? What is it that you need to get rid of to move forward? Was there chaotic change while learning something new in the past or now? What do you need to learn, or what are you interested in learning right now to help you get through the next 5 years? Because this phase between transit Saturn to transit Uranus is about a 5-year phase. Well, actually, it's almost 4 now because we've been in it for about a year and a half. And if you are old enough to remember, what did you learn out of the last 2 conjunctions in 1988 or 1942? What was it that you were developing in 1988, parts of which have to be let go now to move on? You've mastered some of it. And if you've mastered some of it, how can you share that mastery part of it with your community? Because Uranus is the sign of community, of the global community, the 11th house, the group. What is it about what you've mastered that you can share with the organization or the group? And what do you need? Oh, no, I went backwards. Sorry. Sorry, I hit the wrong button here. Yeah, this is funny. The late 70s was the personal computer. The late 80s was the cell phone. Now we have Zoom, GoToMeeting, international video news. And of course, maybe the future is 3-dimensional everything. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Uranus, Neptune. I don't want to spend a lot of time because I want to talk about Jupiter, Neptune, but I think we have to look at the 1992, 1993 conjunction. because it really happened in our lifetime, and it really, you know, doesn't happen in people's lifetimes all the time. It's a 172-year conjunction. There is a masked character on here because I want to make sure I don't know if any of you know any of my work, but I do work with mythology and archetypes and the planets. And I talk a lot about this in my business astrology book, which is really actually a pretty good natal book too. Neptune is the god Dionysus, who is the god of ecstasy and madness. He is also associated with the theater, the mask of comedy and the mask of tragedy. And so Neptune is very much associated with masks, not seeing things clearly, obviously the fog, right? Whenever Uranus and Neptune come together every 172 years in the world, if you look at history, borders and boundaries in the world begin to dissipate. And you see mass exoduses of refugees all over the world. This is very typical. And if you think about, a natural wheel that starts with Aries, and you know that Aquarius is the 11th house. The 11th house is the house of the stranger, Uranus. So here's Uranus, the stranger, mass exodus of refugees crossing, leaching into different countries. This is very, very, very typical of when Uranus Neptune begins. And we know what's been going on in the world since 1992 and 1993 because of a lot of reasons. And it was particularly marked when Saturn in 2019 moved to about 19-20 degrees of Capricorn and went over this conjunction, and we saw masses, and this is when President 45 was in office, and the issue about the border and the wall and all these people trying to escape their countries. I mean, very typical. It's a time of deregulation. Now, I also wanted to say that in the beginning, when this first started, and it was the rise of gangs as well. Uranus is groups. And this was the time of the rising of the gangs and the masks and the horrible beheadings that we saw, because it was also the time when Pluto was traveling over these degrees, which brought the darkness. We also, very interesting, mass viruses, Uranus, large, big dealers, Neptune viruses. We saw some very big flu epidemics between 1992 and 1993. And I think we started to see the beginning of the craziness in the world. I mean, it was just probably because there's so many people on the planet and so little land left, and the striving for resources. But there's always a mask somehow, and there's some fun things here, like you probably don't know who this was. This was called The Lone Ranger. It was a kids' TV show in the early 50s. And, he was interesting. He was a Texas Ranger that became a vigilante. And it went online. It went on television when Saturn was conjoining Neptune in 1951. And also interesting, Uranus-Neptune was conjunct at 19-20 degrees in Capricorn, the same year that Jim Carrey brought the movie The Mask out. See, this is the fun stuff of astrology. You could see these things every place you look, if you look hard enough. But then we also saw this, where we saw massive beheadings on video, Uranus networks, very threatening and very terrifying. Now for better stuff, okay, the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, that's coming up April 12th, 2022. It will be at 23 degrees of Pisces. And I love this quote. This is the head of I have quotes at the beginning of each of my chapters and pushing through time. I love this quote by Mark Twain. You cannot depend on your eyes when your imagination is out of focus. I just love it. I love it. And so, I mean, there's some good news and some challenging news with the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. The first thing I need to say, interesting, is that at the end of this month, on June 20, see, I have it in front of me, June 25 of this month, 2021, Neptune is retrograding at 23 degrees of Pisces, 11 minutes. Neptune will go direct this year on December 1, at 20 degrees of Pisces, 24 minutes. Meantime, back at the ranch, Jupiter is in Pisces. It's going to go back to Aquarius. It's going to go back into Pisces at the end of December. And what will happen at the end of this year as Neptune starts moving forward again in Pisces and Jupiter starts moving forward in Pisces, when they come together and conjoin on April 12th of 2022, they will be at the degree at which Neptune stations this month. So my thought on this is look to see where that's happening in your chart. Look to see the house that Neptune rules. What new idea? What creative thing would you like to do? What part of your life is confusing that you need to sort through? Because this, when Jupiter comes together, it'll be clear. This is like the work now, and then when the Jupiter Neptune happens, it's clarity, more clarity. The other thing that I also want to mention is the last Jupiter Neptune conjunction that took place was in May of 2009 at 26 degrees of Aquarius. Now, where was that in your chart in 2009? And what houses do Jupiter and Neptune, obviously it would be Pisces as well as Sag, rule? And what new ideas, what new vision, what new creativity were you doing or learning in 2009 through now? And because we're at the end of the cycle now, what are you needing to let go of? I wanted to mention this. This is the chart that I use and a lot of people use for the USA Declaration of Independence. We all know, of course, we're having a Pluto return in February of next year. That's not really what I want to talk about. What I want to look at here is the fact that in this chart, in the US, let me get my arrow going. In the US chart, Mars 21, 22, mutable, squares Neptune 22, 25, mutable, natally. Right now, Neptune is stationing, it's going to be stationing at 23, which means in April of this year, in May of this year, in August of this year, and finally on March 1st of next year, Neptune in the US chart will be opposing Neptune and squaring Mars. Now, I think in terms of the craziness we're seeing out of there, I'm hoping that after these pass, it'll get a little bit better. I'm looking at a more mundane interpretation, which is Mars is manufacturing on a more mundane level. And what we're seeing, Neptune squaring Mars there is a problem right now. This is the problem with supply chains. There's not, because we had to stop. A lot of those had to stop last year because of the pandemic. So there's not enough supply chain. So this means that prices are way up. Cars are interesting. Mercury rules cars, but Mars is mechanical equipment. They're up very high right now. Rental cars are up to $600 and $700 a day now. Food prices are going up. We're going to see more and more inflation as this thing continues and squares Mars and opposes Neptune. I also think that this has a lot to do with the confusion about what to do around gun control. Because Mars is, the warrior, it's guns. And Neptune and the craziness, the madness around, everybody got, this is a terrible thing to say, but everybody got their shots and then they started killing people again. You get your pandemic shot, then you go out and kill people. And there is this insanity right now. And a lot of it has to do with media. And I do think the media has a big play in this. So, this is a really fascinating chart. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I do feel this is also mergers, because Neptune rules mergers, squaring Mars. We're going to see a lot more mergers coming up in this next year with Jupiter Neptune, which is also interesting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think you should know. David Beasley has a chart for the New York Stock Exchange. The data that he has for that is May 17th, 1792 at 11:58:16 a.m. in New York. This is his chart. He worked in the markets for a long time. He swears by it. And the New York Stock Exchange chart is a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Libra. Yeah, and Pluto has been squaring that position for the last few years. It's been pushing it up. The last Jupiter-Neptune conjunction that took place in 2009 was on this stock exchange, Pluto. And the next one is coming up in the 7th house of other people, open enemies, markets. And, you know, I'm giving this, if you want to do any research on this, you can have it. And I would say again, do watch the Saturn-Uranus square next year. Because here we have a Taurus. Oops, I wish I can get it. We have a Sun, Mercury in Taurus. We have a Pluto in Aquarius. We have Uranus in Leo. The eclipses will be squaring and on these points. And as Saturn and Uranus move further in, they'll be hitting these points. So, you know, I don't think day trading is a really good idea for a person like myself. I think long-term investments where you just keep it in there when you have losses and gains is the smart way to do it if you're going to do any sort of investing. And that's for another day. So here's the other thing. The reality of debt, I think, is coming. Jupiter is big and Neptune is believing there isn't any debt, but there is debt. And Neptune has a lot to do with denial, but denial doesn't change things. Debt and inflation will often surface with Jupiter-Neptune. There's lots of job losses we've had, loss of incomes, loss of viable livings, unless you've worked virtually. I mean, that's the whole K economy everybody's talking about. The people who are fortunate enough to work online have been okay. But then there's the first line workers who have to have their hands on things. They're not okay. And my sense, though, of this is that as we move through this next few years, that the people that are the first line workers, there's going to be something that's going to help them get back on track with some of the technology that's coming, but I'm not exactly, I have some ideas about it, but I'm not ready to talk about it. I think higher taxes are going to be coming to pay for all the losses of these last years, which is why we're going to have inflation. Neptune represents mergers, you know, waters merging. This means companies will do this as many as well as community members will be merging. A lot of new social programs and a lot of new jobs, like debt counselors will be part of a lot of new industry. There's been a pretty unbridled expansion as far as spending in the last few years. Sometimes when people are depressed, Neptune rules depression, they spend more. From June of 2009 to early 2020 was the longest ever expansion period of over 121 months. The pandemic came, red flag warnings abounded as landowners and workers and companies had to adapt, creating a domino effect in industry. And so, you know, we have to pay for all this. You know, this is something, this is from Fortune magazine, and this, let me go this way. This is also from Fortune magazine, from the last quarter square to Neptune, which we're still in, moving into the balsamic phase. This is the amount of debt from Fortune magazine from an article in 2019, that in 2018, we were 21.5 trillion in debt. And the projection then was in 2048, there would be a 144% increase, which is, I think, one of the reasons we're seeing all this cryptocurrency starting to come in, because it's intangible, but then it has its problems too. No, we don't need that. Okay, mergers and acquisitions. I thought this would be interesting. You know, you were all talking about the eclipse when I came on, when you were discussing the lunar eclipse that was on May 26th and the solar eclipse that we had on Thursday the 10th. Alphabet's the mother company of Google. This is in line with my Jupiter-Saturn chart, which shows medical databases expanding. Well, on May 26th, which happened to be the day of the 5-degree Sag, 5-degree Gemini, total lunar eclipse, Alphabet, the mother company of Google, bought HealthNet, which is a big medical database. And I mean, it's no surprise that they did that. And on the left, you have the HealthNet database on the left, and they're pretty ripe for a merger here, because here's Moon. Moon is the product, by the way. The Moon is a product in a company, and this is a time chart from Michael Munkasi's database. So their Moon is at 20 Pisces, their Jupiter is 24 Pisces, their Uranus networks is at 27 Pisces, their rising is 24 Pisces, and Neptune is stationing at 23 Pisces and will conjoin at 23 Pisces in the spring. The last Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in May of 2009 was at 26 Aquarius, right under Neptune Chiron. And Chiron has a lot to do with medical. And on the right is the Alphabet Google Union chart of January 4th of 2021, which has the Jupiter, Saturn, and the Pluto here. So, you know, I'm not surprised that they bought them up, and I think we'll probably be seeing more of that. We also saw on the same day, which was, I thought was really interesting. This all happened on the lunar eclipse. Amazon went and bought MGM. I don't know if you knew that, but the reason Amazon bought them is because they were in heavy-duty competition with Time Warner, which became Warner Net, who had bought Discovery. And so Amazon decided the last one to buy is MGM. And if you actually look at the charts between the two of them, they're a pretty good match. But what was interesting, if you look at the Amazon chart and the lunar eclipse that happened that day, this is the 90-degree dial where you see the sun and the moon opposite each other on Amazon's sun, which is 7 degrees of Gemini. It was right on their sun with Ceres, which is interesting because we're having that Uranus-Ceres conjunction right now. I mean, these are fun charts to look at if you have a lot of time and nothing else to do, but we're going to be seeing stuff like this. And, you know, my question is, what happened to the trust busts? What happened to the Sherman Trust Act, Sherman Trust Bust Act? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. But it's also the expansion of the imagination. And I wanted to make sure I mentioned this with Jupiter Neptune. I mean, the last time, and you know, if you have a lot of time, nothing else to do, the last time Jupiter conjoined Neptune in Pisces was 18 Pisces, and that was back in 1856. So, you know, here's the opportunity to get things right in terms of our debt, in terms of, you know, doing some new imagination things. If we don't take care of it, Saturn Neptune will come along and take care of it for us in February 20th of 2026. But the key thing with Synodics is they always breed new industries. You know, if you want to look at imagination industries, here's a list of the Jupiter-Neptune conjunctions of the last, I don't know, 200 or so years. They're in the book. Sleep is Neptune, right? Sleep is, you know, people have problems with sleep right now. I think it's because of all the technology. I love this quote from Shelley. I arise from dreams of thee in the first sweet sleep of night. And Coleridge, oh, sleep, it is a gentle thing. And I think as Jupiter gets closer to Neptune and makes its conjunction, we're going to see more and more work, hopefully good work, being done on sleep problems being fixed and moved to the front. Because what happens when people don't sleep, anxiety increases, worry increases, and mental illness increases because the brain does not have time to rest. And so I'm thinking, hopefully we'll see more with that. It's going to be a new frontier. One of the other things that happens when you don't treat your sleep apnea or you have problems with sleep, you get increased cardiovascular disease, hardening of the arteries, depression, memory problems. And if you think about, you know, this is how I make my connections. If you think about how everybody's been isolated for about a year, almost a year and a half, and everybody's been on technologies just trying to make connections with each other. And being on technology, not a few hours a day, but 12, 13, 15 hours a day. I am sure, and all the anxiety of the pandemic to boot, and all the fear and all that stuff, this may be one of the reasons we're seeing the chaos and the craziness when people go out and start shooting people. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for it, but I'm hoping that as we move through this cycle, that we start to have more help for mental illness. I do know that a lot of the police departments in a lot of the cities are starting to do a thing when a 911 call comes in, where they're differentiating between whether it's a crime or it's a person who's having a mental break. And then they're sending a social worker out to help the person with a mental break. I know they're doing that in, of all places, St. Petersburg, Florida, which is a lot like San Francisco used to be years ago in the middle of all that other craziness. And it's happening with a lot of cities now. They're trying to differentiate between mental illness, and a crime. And I'm hoping that as we get closer to this, we have a better take on it. Neptune also rules fluids, the world's fluids and the body's fluids. We'll be seeing more about the lymphatic system and the blood system. We'll see a lot more growth and approval in areas like stem cell research. We'll see, and we're already seeing it, faster developing vaccines to combat disease, even the common cold. I think we're going to see more work on preserving the oceans and addressing the issues of healthy water, which we obviously need to look at, or the lack of water, and water purification and desalinization, even perhaps creating water. I've always wondered, why can't we create water? We're going to see, and we're actually seeing this return. It was happening in the 50s and 70s during the last quarter squares of Jupiter to Neptune, where they're using more psychotropic drugs in therapy for depression and other related mental illnesses. And I think we're going to be seeing that. I think the rise of cannabis stocks on the stock market, dispensaries, I think we're going to see a lot of that, since Neptune is psychotropic drugs. It's a big business apparently right now. Filter technologies, especially since the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction will be in the Scorpio decadent of Pisces, which is about taking dead things and make them into new things. Filters that clean things like the seawater. Filters that cool water, ballast water, industrial and service water. I think those are going to be big industries. The filtration of liquid fuels, the filtration of the blood. I have a slide on that in a moment. The filtration of soil. As transit Uranus sextiles Neptune between 2025 to 2027, we will see more of this. And I think Jupiter and Uranus will be at 22 Taurus, which also is cleaning of the soil, and the filtration of the air, Uranus and Mercury. This is interesting. I love this drawing. It's graphene. It's the thing they put in seawater to clean it. And I just loved it. And there's the filter right there in the middle. Medical tech filters are one of the fastest growing industries right now. They actually are designing a blood filter that's designed to filter COVID. It's developed by a company called DARPA. There's also in development a tissue-like gel that can be put under the skin and tell you the chemical reactions inside the body. It's a microchip that decides, if it sees the body going towards COVID or something else. I don't know how I feel about that, but they are in development with this. And it's also about the right side of the brain. I think Saturn has a lot to do with the logic in the left side. And I think that the right side, which is, if you're looking at this, it's actually reversed in the picture. It should be the other way. There was a great book written years ago called Psychology of Consciousness by Robert Ornstein. And he talked about the bridge. There's literally a tissue bridge between the two sides of the brain that's called, it's called the corpus callosum. That's a typo. That should say corpus callosum. I apologize. And the thing that he discovered and that I've read about over the years, which is music, which is Neptune, is that what music does, it stimulates the corpus callosum, which joins the two sides of the brain, so the logic can work with the imagination. And I, if you think in terms of, what we hear on a daily basis, if it's loud noise or if it's, the programming we get from whatever news stations we're watching, I think it's very important to be mindful of this. I know for myself, when I do writing, and I do a lot of writing, I find, I start to say to myself, why am I having a hard time? And then I remember I hadn't turned my music on with no words, just certain orchestrations. And once I start doing that, boy, it just comes right out of me. And so I think the idea of sounds and music and images that we feed our brains is very, very important to connect the right and the left brain. I'm hoping we see more research with this in the next few years and that we pick the right influences. Ray Bradbury wrote a very interesting book in the 1950s, which is interesting during the McCarthy era. I don't know if you read the book or if you saw a film, Fahrenheit 451. Books were only one type of receptacle where we stored a lot of things we were afraid we might forget. There's nothing magical in them at all. The magic is only in what books say, how they stitched the patches of the universe together into one garment for us. And it's an interesting book because it's written in the 1950s before anybody had those big screens. And basically in the story, people are not allowed to read books. They're only allowed to watch big screens that are, zeroed in by the government into their homes. If they are found with books, the books are burned. The firemen are not firemen that put out the fire in your house. The firemen are the ones that come and burn your books. And so, we do listen to news 24/7 now, and we are getting programmed 24/7. And I think this does affect us. And I think it's one of those things with the Jupiter Neptune that we need to be mindful of, as to what is true and what is not true. And I do think, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way again. There we go. We need to be careful that we don't go down the mistruth rabbit hole. There's no shortcuts when it comes to truth. So, I think it's important with this Jupiter Neptune that's coming up. If you read something that looks at things one way, to try to read things that looks at things from the other side, so we have a much more objective view of things. And I'm hoping once we get past that conjunction, we can have that. And this is for you all to see. This is the Jupiter Neptune conjunction for next spring, April 12th, 2022. This is calculated for Greenwich at 2:42 p.m. And here we have the Jupiter Neptune. It's a first quarter moon in Virgo, right here. It's interesting because it's like this sling or basket with the handle of the moon. Here's Jupiter Neptune in the 7th house of other people. The moon is the ruler of the 11th house, the global community, the product. Jupiter here rules the 4th house. I do think, interesting, I wanted to make sure I said this. I think that there is no inventory in homes right now, at least on several of the coasts and several cities. And housing prices have gone way out of sight in several cities. And I think part of it is because the mortgages have been like 1% and 2% and 3%. I do think we're going to see more and more inflation with housing prices, and that it is very important to really look at the cycle of the place in which you live. Because, I mean, even if you were to sell your home, if you own a home right now, where are you going to go right now? This is the thing you have to think about before you make that decision. But I do think we're going to see a lot of inflation with housing prices and new kinds of housing, emerging houses. I mean, we're already seeing big houses for multi-generational families. We're seeing tiny houses for, the micro houses. But I think we're going to see more kinds of housing, maybe for smaller spaces where you can actually move the rooms around. I mean, that's very Jupiter Neptune, move a wall and get a bigger room, those kinds of things. But I don't think we're seeing it quite yet, but I do think it's coming. But it's a nice chart. I think it's an interesting thing to look at if you want to study it and see what you see in terms of trends. And, in a few years, we'll have Saturn, Neptune conjoining. It's time to pay attention as we see more global disruption because of the failure of the electrical grids and tech leaks. Now is the time to take care of business, take care of things that we've all been avoiding. This is the Saturn, Neptune chart for Greenwich, February 20th, 2026. 4:52 p.m. It'll be a new moon phase. The sun will be in Pisces and moon will still be in the new moon cycle. Pluto will be leading. It's a bull. Pluto is leading the pack here, ruling the 4th house housing. Saturn, Neptune is often associated with oil leaks in the oceans, ocean disasters, but it's also associated, as I said earlier, with new forms of the arts, music, theater, film. Neptune rules plastics, it rules wine, it rules any kind of liquid, so new forms. It begs global cooperation with this chart, with Uranus at the top, ruling the 6th house of systems, databases, techniques, methods, service, and health systems. And so, this is kind of a fun chart to study, over the next few years and watch the transits. I wanted to share that with you. I know it's a few years away, but it's always kind of good to see forward and go back in history and see the past. So for you, the individual. I know this is a lot of information, and I know a lot of you are sitting there either napping or you've left the room. All you need to do is take one thing out of this lecture. Pick one synodic cycle. Look at the last date it occurred in your chart. See where it's coming again. You can use one that's more frequent, like Jupiter Saturn's 20 years, but Jupiter Neptune and Jupiter Pluto and Jupiter Uranus are roughly about 12. See what had happened last time. Look at the houses it rules in your chart, how you've changed, what you're letting go of. Or you can look at the bigger cycle, the Saturn Pluto that took place in 1980. Prior to that would have been 1947, I think, in Leo. So what houses do those planet rules include them? Where did you change, or where are you changing? And where will you go next? Try to track both the path of the faster planet against the original conjunction, which is one of the ways I look at it, or make it easy and just look at transit to transit. Although the transit of the faster planet against the original conjunction in your own life is really fascinating to watch, to see how you changed over time. And the last question I say, what are you willing to do to change? Where did the new phase in your chart begin? In 2020, Jupiter Pluto was at 25 Capricorn. That began something new. In 2020, Saturn Pluto was at 23 Capricorn, and Jupiter Saturn was at 0 Aquarius. They were very close to each other. Jupiter Neptune will be at 23 Pisces in 22. Saturn Uranus will be at 28 Gemini in 2032. And what's breaking down from 2009? What's breaking down from 1988? It's kind of a great way to look at our lives or our businesses or our families or our clients. Because I know we're getting a lot of clients right now because a lot of people need answers. And so finally, this is so key. It's never too late to be what you might have been. Get educated, folks. Learn new things. Find new avenues. Incorporate those avenues into the existing structures that work for you and move forward. And then these are some of the upcoming lectures. They'll be at our website. I'm going to be open for questions in a moment. This is the 2020. A lot of people have been asking about this. The cheat sheet we put out every year for $6.95 is coming in late August. We just put the 2021 on sale for $2.95. It's a nice little thing to have at the desk that's color coded for when things reach their shadow, the eclipses. This is the books, Pushing Through Time and Business Astrology. And I'm going to stop my share right now. Okay, so we can ask questions. Okay.
Well, that was a lot. That was a lot of information. That was really amazing, Georgia. I think that there's a lot of us that will be going back and looking at this YouTube.
I think it's important to kind of go back and look at pieces of it. I mean, it's a lot, but it's different ways to work with it, and that's what I wanted to show.
Yeah. One person did ask, why would Neptune involve vaccines? She thought Mars ruled vaccines.
Vaccines, liquids. It's a liquid. It's a liquid, right. And it goes into the bloodstream. Neptune's the blood.
It might be injected with the needle, which would be kind of Mars-like, but it's the liquid that's
still Neptune. It's that liquid that's flowing through your body. If you think about infusions, or you think about IVs. I mean, yeah, it's Mars that pierces, but Neptune is the fluid that goes in there.
Right, but I mean, I've always heard of Mars being the blood because Mars rules iron.
Right. I'm talking about the flow.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
I'm talking about the flow because you have to combine things. Mars is the blood. It rules iron. It rules steel.
Yes, and I see somebody said Neptune rules viruses, but I've also heard about Pluto ruling viruses because viruses stay hidden and go dormant and then they erupt, and that's Plutonian.
I think we have to look at a lot of different things when we look at these because they have different, it's like the difference between a merger and acquisition. A merger is a Neptune thing because people come together in a like-minded way to work with each other. They join. Acquisition is Pluto. It goes in and grabs you. because you're not doing too well. And it's the same thing with viruses. You know, you can either catch them by exchanging fluids, you can exchange them in the air, or they come in and they grab you. I think you have to look at all of it. I do know that Ed Tamplin, he's gone now. He was a great astrologer in Australia. He was a friend of mine. He did a lot of work on the Ebola virus. And his stuff might still be up on his website about that many years ago. 1979, I think Saturn was in Virgo. Anyway, he did a lot of work with that. It'd be interesting to see some books on virus and medical. I'd love to see more on that with research. But anyway.
Georgia, what's the name of your book that you kept referring to your book? What's the name of it?
It's called Pushing Through Time. Synodic cycles and their developing phases. That's one of the books I showed on the screen. I'll put it here on the thing here. Synodic cycles and their developing, whoops, I hate these small keyboards. And then the other one is Business Astrology 101, which is actually a good basic text, weaving the web between myth and weaving the web between, I can't spell, between myth and story astrology. Okay.
Sandy Sylvester has raised her hand. She'd like to pose a question.
Well, I just wanted to add, as far as the AAZ, on June 26th, the astrologer his name is Anthony Lewis, and the lecture is between 1 and 3 p.m. and it's referring to the Lord of the Orb, which is the planetary hour at birth and its ruler, and it also has a lot to do with solar returns.
Ooh.
Okay, everybody can look on that on their website to find out more about that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. I'm sorry, Georgia. I thought it was she was going to have a question for you. Anybody else have a question for Georgia?
I do.
Hi,
I thought I wrote it in the chat, but could you please comment in terms of the synodic cycle or cycles on Bretton Woods and the world reserve currency?
Oh, wow. I'm going to be doing a whole currency thing in September for Kansas for that group. Bretton Woods was not, well, we went off the gold standard in 1971. You know, I actually, oh, I know what it was. I think it's the Saturn Pluto. I think I cover that in the book. You know, it's been a while since I wrote this. Yeah, I think I covered that in the book. Yeah, because we went off the gold in 71 August. I think Neptune was going into Sag 0 degrees. And yeah, I think that's it. I think it has to do with Saturn Pluto. Bretton Woods signing of the articles. It's in the book. Actually, Bretton Woods signing of the articles of the agreement, December 27th, 1945. Saturn was at 22 Cancer and Pluto was at 11 Leo. So Saturn was moving into the balsamic phase of Pluto. So that's when all that stuff changed around that time, 1945. It was right before the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1947. And then if you go, you know, another so many years during the balsamic phases, things changed again. But I'll be covering that in the current, it's very complicated. This stuff is very complicated. And I apologize if I was too complicated for you folks. Sorry. Did the best I could.
Not at all. I mean, you make it quite clear, Georgia. It's just it requires us to do our homework. I mean, until we really sit down and do our own homework and see how it applies to us, how what was happening for each of us during those cycles, that's when we really start to grasp what's going on. I mean, I love your historical data. That is always fascinating, and we can go back on this YouTube and see your charts for that, and perhaps apply it to our lives or the lives of our elders or family.
Yeah, really, that's a great way to do it. You know, I mean, it's funny because this took me 30 years to write this book. Literally 30 years. I had probably, I don't know, boxes and boxes, terrible research. And it was really hard to attack this subject because there was not a lot written. I mean, I went through and I looked at Cycles of Becoming by Ruperti. I liked his work. But I had all these notes about things that happened during conjunctions. And that's what I started noticing historically. Something would happen again when the same thing came back. And then I thought, well, what about development? And then I went through all of that to find that, and because each one of these chapters, like Saturn Pluto, is about debt and money. And it does cover Bretton Woods and the change of currency. That's the chapter on that. The Saturn Neptune chapter is about the change in the styles of music from the late 1800s, you know, going through the cycles. The Jupiter Neptune is about the core of discovery. When Lewis and Clark went with Sacagawea across the country to expand, you know, Jupiter Neptune, expand our lands. And each chapter covers a historical event with its history, looking at that cycle. And because I had so many different things, I had to decide, okay, this chapter has to be about this, which is involved with these. So people get the idea. It's very, it's hard. It's hard. But it helps to know at least some of this, because when you're working with a client, because I see a lot of people who are self-employed or working for themselves, and, you know, they go through a lot of changes. And if we don't know our symbols and if we don't know our cycles, it's really hard to kind of give them insight, because that's what they come to us for, is for insight about what other things do we see that they don't see.
Right.
And so reading stuff like this, even though you might not remember it, I can't even remember what I wrote after all those years, you know, but I'm looking in the book, oh yeah, that was Bretton Woods, Saturn, Pluto. Really helps us with our client work. I mean, I usually spend about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes before I work with a client, going through everything in their chart, because I want to make sure I don't miss something. Half the time I don't cover all of it, but at least I have my homework. I do my homework. Let's put it that way. Yeah, a lot of homework.
It sounds like it. Really. Have a comment here from somebody, from Mo Byrne, who says, Georgia, you are an exceptional teacher. The depth of your content and your ability to guide us through it. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure.
And another person is going to go, thought the talk's really interesting. She's going to go check her chart for 1988 dates.
Yeah, I think that's real. I mean, a lot of us were around then. Okay, what was happening in 1988? What does Saturn rule in your chart? What does Uranus rule? And I do use Saturn as Capricorn, unless I'm needing something faster, I'll use it for Aquarius. And look at Uranus, which rules Aquarius. Those two houses are next to each other in the chart. What was there new that you started, and what is it that you need to let go of now so you can move forward? And what do you have to learn so you can move forward? You know, if you want to keep, like, you know, 2032 is 11 years away, right? That's a lot of years. I mean, for me it is. But for somebody in their 40s, it's not a lot of years.
There was a question I missed back a ways. It was about that axial age, started during the triple Uranus, Neptune, Pluto conjunction in Taurus. Could the subsequent conjunctions of Uranus, Neptune, and Uranus, Pluto, and Neptune, Pluto track the timing of religious?
That would be a very interesting article, I think. I think that's really good. The axis, yeah, because the Neptune Pluto that started in the one that was at 8 degrees Gemini, 8 degrees, yeah, 8 degrees in the late 1800s. That, you know, that was when the spiritualist movement started. And I actually, it's also interesting because that was also when I think Nellie Bly went into she was 22 years old. She went into the asylums to do amazing story, to do an investigation on madness in an asylum. And she was very young, and they got her out, and she was lauded for that, and she traveled all over the world. But I think that would be really cool if somebody wanted to go back and do that Neptune Pluto through history to look at the spiritual movements. If you have a lot of time and nothing else to do, I'd love to see an article. I think that's brilliant. Who said that, Derek?
Derek, there, you've thrown down the gauntlet to Derek. Okay.
That's your assignment, Derek, to
For
write
the rest of my life, I think. It took you 30 years to write that book. It'll take me the rest of my life to come out with something.
Yeah, but I had a lot of distractions. Yeah. Anyway.
There was this comment by Jane about when you were talking about Alphabet. I think that was when she was referring to
Alphabet
it.
mother company of Google bought HCA, HealthNet.
Yeah, she said they must have an astrologer on the staff.
You know, I thought the same thing. When I saw that, it was like right on schedule. I mean, on the day. It was on the day. And I thought it was interesting that both those pieces of news came on the day of the eclipse.
The print on the chart was so tiny I couldn't capture the
If anybody
dates that
wants
you had.
them, I can send you the charts if you want them.
Great.
And
great.
here's I'll give you my email in the chat if you want any of I am going on a vacation tomorrow because I really need one. I'll be back soon, but I will make sure that I get this stuff out to you. Here's my email, stathis.georgia@gmail.com. If you want a copy of the James Mars Langham article from the 1930s about Saturn Uranus aspects, if you want, what else did she want? Something else. Just mentioned. What was the other thing the charts, the bigger charts. I can send them to you.
The charts for Alphabet and the timing when they bought HealthNet.
Okay. Actually, if you want, hold on a second. I do have a printout.
You could just send it to me and I'll forward it to anybody who wants it. Yes, Sandy?
Yes, I just would like to ask Georgia, and this is has nothing to do with necessarily Bitcoin, but do you see the world, especially the United States, going to a digital currency? And if so, when?
Well, I actually thought that the world would be on a digital currency 35 years ago. I saw Bill Meridian was doing a presentation on something about 30 years ago in a conference. And I remember making a note to myself, does that mean that we're going to have a global currency? And here we are 30 years later, and we're talking about it. I think ultimately there will be a global currency. I do. But there's a problem now, because if you, in fact, one of the workshops I just did, I just used Bitcoin as an example. And I went through and I got the Bitcoin chart. I made it a 0 Aries because we don't have the time for when the Japanese gentleman started it. And then his partner, who bought the first Bitcoin in October of 2009 for 0.006 or 0.009. And I used both those charts. And what I did, I went through 2020 and I made a table comparing both charts and transits to the charts. And in the October 2009 Bitcoin chart, there's no time, but again, we have planets. I saw all these incredible hits to that chart when there were heists, when things were stolen, when things were broken into. And this is the problem with the current cryptocurrencies, it's the whole thing I was talking about with cybersecurity on the Jupiter Saturn with Pluto coming up. First of all, there's no value line for cryptocurrency. There's no value. It's not $1. What's the value? That's the issue. There was on February 17th, I think of this year, it was in one of my presentations, they caught, there'd been about a 10-year, North Korea was about, with 10 different countries, going to steal like $41 million in crypto. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we have all these leaks with cryptocurrency right now because it's a new thing and it's not protected. But ultimately, I do think we will have some sort of global currency or a basket of currencies, which we work with baskets of currencies now. Ultimately, we will. The big thing I think that's important to look at is blockchain.
Yeah.
The underlying software, which I know from a very large bank with whom I have a very personal relationship, has purchased most of the patents for blockchain, banks.
Mhm.
So they're already thinking this way, you know, because it's a blockchain, a buyer and a seller, there's no middle person. So then the question becomes, why is a bank buying this, you know? Yeah, but there is no real history, a value line for the value of cryptocurrency. And it's up and it's down and it's volatile. I think it's a fairly dangerous thing right now until it gets more solidified. But I think
I'm not really referring to cryptocurrency. I'm just saying a digital currency for the United States, because there, you know, the IRS and you loses millions of dollars
oh yeah,
a month because of, you know, cash under the table, you know, all these resources that, you know, cash, money laundering, drugs, everything else. So they're not happy. And with this trillions of dollars worth of debt, I think eventually there's
oh
going
yeah.
to come to Jesus where the IRS says enough is enough with, you know, paying off the books, under the books, over the book. You know, it just doesn't seem feasible, at least for the United States.
Well, I agree with you. I think that, like, the come to Jesus moment, that's a great way to put it. I think we're going to see these things in the next few years. I think that's part of Saturn and the closing square to Uranus is the infrastructure is breaking down. We're seeing leaks. We're seeing breaks. We're seeing ransomware. We're seeing, you know, we're seeing all this stuff happening around the planet. And it's like, it's a terrible analogy, but it's like you've got a 16-year-old and you give them a Porsche.
Yes.
You know, you know, and they don't even know how to drive, and they have all kinds of accidents and things happen until they get it, right? This is like the Porsche for the 16-year-old.
Yeah. Like they're trying to stimulate the economy,
right?
With all of this, you know, unemployment isn't taxable, and all of these credits and all of this stimulus money, but that's not taxable. You know, I just, you know, just wonder what the IRS is agenda-wise and what they're going to be recommending.
Well, you know, that's a really interesting, I should make a note of that. I should look at their chart.
Yeah.
Would it be interesting to look at the IRS chart? Because I know that they're very behind. They never have enough employees. Their computers are always breaking down. I mean, it's the infrastructure, right?
Absolutely, but it, you know, we're on a bubble, and it can't last. It just cannot.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Really enjoyed your lecture. It was just brilliant. I love the historical references and the Virgoan quality of it. Really exceptionally well done.
Well, I think if we know history, we can kind of calm down a little bit about the future. You know? I mean, really, I mean, if you look to see how bad things were before, relatively to that time, and you see very similar threads, just with a different person or a different face or a different circumstance, it's still the same thing. And that's the whole point of what I'm trying to make here is, yeah, things are not so great sometimes, but things change. They don't stay stagnant. So with that, the Colonial Pipeline, yeah, and they got a portion of the ransomware back. Actually, if anybody watches 60 Minutes from last Sunday, I think it was, I think you can get it on demand. They were talking about the concept, I don't think it's going to happen though, where the government wants to get in and the government wants to say, if you get threatened with ransomware, you can't pay it. But I don't think that the government can do that to a business if the business is trying to survive. So, you know, but there's a lot of ransomware. I mean, I know I think it was New Zealand last fall, in the stock market in New Zealand, they were overrun. That's another thing. That's another thing that happens with these computers is there's an overrunning of activity and they have to shut down. And that happened in New Zealand last fall, so that their stock market had to stop for 2 days, I think, or 3 days, because their computers were overrun. I mean, this is all the stuff with all the new technologies. We don't even have the networks now. You know, so we'll see. We'll see how it turns out. It's the beginning.
I think your admonition about the all that space junk and how it could affect our technology. I don't know if I haven't heard about that. You know, I haven't heard anybody warning about that. Lots of other
Really?
things that they've been about, the solar
Actually,
flares or whatnot.
There was a company, I forgot, I should remember, a new company name came in. That there's some companies that are coming in now after the Space Force was started that are out there cleaning up. That's part of the new job. It's a new thing. They're going out to clean up space junk, which is good.
I mean, but it could be just it could be the smallest of particles that just hit in the right place and could wipe something out.
And plus the satellites are old.
Yes.
The satellites are 45, 50, almost 50 years old.
Just
And
like the
they're-
grid system, our grid system is so vulnerable, and
That's,
and those transistors are literally the size of houses, and there's no backup.
that's part of the closing square between Saturn and Uranus, the breaking down of the infrastructure. And the supply lines, Neptune square Mars in the US chart, where there's not enough, the supply lines are delayed, and all the cars are delayed now too, because the chips aren't ready. But Taiwan is the one that produces them, and I guess Taiwan and Samsung are coming to the United States to produce chips here. Intel and Taiwan are coming to produce chips here. So I went back into Intel. And the chips are newer. They're like, they're different shapes. They're faster. All kinds of interesting stuff. I mean, just could write swaths of stuff on this. Anyway, it's the future,
Yes. So it probably won't be until the like the episodic phase of the Saturn Uranus
Right.
that something, real innovation gets
Right.
thought of.
Right. Yeah, and somebody just wrote, Elizabeth wrote, Elon Musk wants to go up and clean up. There's Elon Musk again.
Yeah.
22 degrees Cancer. I
And
think.
I'd like to see his chart. He's heading into outer space, doing one of his little. He's actually putting his body in space.
He's a
in the-
character. I know he's a Cancer, and I know he's born in Pretoria, but there's no time for him. He's a June 21st or 23rd Cancer, and he's born in South Africa, Pretoria, but there's no time that I've been able to find for him.
Jeff Bezos is going into space too with his brother.
And he's going on his Saturn return. Bezos is going on his Saturn return. Anyway.
And it's funny
I
how,
don't know.
Georgia, you've been so on point with the infrastructure. I mean, Biden, every other word out of his mouth is the infrastructure, and I don't remember that really being a huge issue in other, presidential platforms.
Well, also too, Biden's Uranus, he's a Saturn Uranus Gemini. I mean, he was born right after the 29 Taurus in 1942.
Oh.
And the US will have its Uranus return at the same time that Biden's having his.
Oh, wow.
I mean, we've got a few years to go with Biden, of course, but the US is not too far from their Uranus return. And actually, if you look at the declaration chart, which is in here somewhere, I think it's Uranus. Mars is Gemini, 21 degrees, and Uranus, I think, is in the 6th. I think it's in the 6th house. I'm sure it's in the 6th house. I have the chart here somewhere. Yeah, Uranus. I can't even read my own writing. You're right. It's very small. Let's see. Yeah, Uranus is something. It looks like 3 or 8 Gemini. So there's, we just had an eclipse on our Uranus also. So.
Oh.
Yeah.
I would think it's very dangerous for those two to go up in space at the same time. I mean, what
What could happen?
Do you think they'll come back?
Something could happen.
Do you think they'll come back? Maybe they're returning to their countries.
Yeah.
Maybe they're going home.
Yeah, maybe.
You never know.
Oh.
Anyway, it's been fun.
Anyway,
I'm gonna
yes.
have to go because I have something else coming up right now. But it's been so fun working with all of you. Thank you for staying and listening and walking
We've
through
enjoyed
with
it.
me. And have a wonderful summer and a good year from everybody. here to everybody there.
Thank
To
you.
you, to
Bye-bye.
you as well.
Thank
Peace.
you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I'm gonna have
Okay.
to re-listen to that. Very information packed.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. I was taking notes and I thought of things I thought, I'd want to remember, but I couldn't. Yeah, I still, some of the charts were great. And I'll look forward to getting those dates for those companies. That could be
Yeah.
very interesting.
A project that somebody could potentially undertake would be to rectify Elon Musk's chart.
Hmm.
Said he doesn't have a birth time. Apparently, they didn't put it on the birth certificate in South Africa, but he's led such a public life and had a bunch of specific interesting things happening where he made $1 billion with PayPal and then sold that and started Tesla and SpaceX and, a couple of marriages and kids and things like that. I would think there would be enough historical events that somebody could take the basic chart of his birthday and figure out what his ascendant and what time of day and so on. Just a
Well,
thought.
go for it, Frank. There's a great project.
Well, we've already designated Derek as having a great project for him to.
Well, yeah, there's two of you.
Should undertake a great project here.
I was going to tell her my dad was born in 1892 under that Neptune-Pluto conjunction. And he invented an apparatus to find ore bodies under the ground, that electronic apparatus.
Oh.
Pluto underworld, underground, Neptune imagination.
Fascinating.
Yes, Susie. Susie. What? Can't hear you yet. Susie, can't hear you yet. Can't hear you. We should be able to hear you. Your mic must not be turned on or something.
Probably a system of volume issue. I don't know.
Maybe you could unplug your mic and just talk through the mic on the laptop.
That's what she's doing, but it's not working. Make sign language, Susie. Okay, bye. So Dale, you're quite a historian too. I mean, you must have enjoyed all the historical references.
Oh well, I definitely did. I mean, one of the things that was going on coinciding with the last Neptune-Jupiter cycle was there was an opioid epidemic in the US. And of course, that's ongoing now. There's far more people dying of opioid addictions than there are dying of COVID in this country. And there's big pharmaceutical money in that. And so yeah, this was a lot of food for thought, and going to be looking at even more history.
So, I mean, pharmaceuticals companies are rolled by Neptune, right? It's the drugs, all that.
And the other thing about this is I'm not as optimistic as Georgia is, because one of the things that's been going on in terms of water is during this era is whenever they do fracking, they permanently destroy the water table. And we've already had just on in terms of the number of people and use of water that the aquifers have already been going down. So yeah. I think that'll be real interesting. And I think one of the things about this is just the power of prayer and belief. And but it wouldn't surprise me if people just start praying for water again. And obviously some people are already doing that right now. And but I believe in miracles, quite frankly, and I think we're going to need them. Really.
There was some comment on her on on the side of one of her slides was about creating water. All the different things that were going to come up under the conjunction. There, it was about water was actually creating water. Anybody else notice that?
And in terms of creating water, I mean, just think of, biblical stories about the parting of the Red Sea, or Jesus turning water into wine, and all this sort of thing. So I think it's going to be really, because the other thing that was happening around that time was there was a lot of empathy that came out coinciding with Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it was, pre-Civil War, and there was a lot of, the country was divided significantly. And the other thing in terms of Uranus cycles for the United States is the first Uranus return was the Civil War. And so there's always instability every time we have the Uranus return. So when she talked about, Biden's Uranus return, the Uranus return here, it's a wild and wacky time that we're in and heading into.
Yeah, I hadn't put the Uranus return together with what Nick Hagen-Best said years ago about U.S. always going through its wars when Uranus was in Gemini. I guess at the end of Taurus, it's leading up to the war too. I mean, that's.
And the other thing about the Uranus and Taurus, even without the synodic cycles, is the U.S. became the world reserve currency, and it wasn't the pound sterling anymore. And so things are changing right now, and that's why I asked about Bretton Woods, and to see what what sort of cycle is in here now. And there's a lot of people know China and Russia and India are starting to trade without trading in or entirely in U.S. dollars. So there's a lot of changes afoot.
I mean, Iran also got became under fire because they started trading in other currency than the U.S. dollar.
Sure. Every time that a country stops trading in U.S. dollars, they're in trouble. They get invaded. It happened with Iraq under Hussein, and then it happened with Gaddafi and Libya. It's like, you don't mess with the U.S. It's like, if you think you're going to try and go around the U.S.'s back, then the U.S. is going to take you out. Except that now, when you get big countries, powerful countries like China and India coming together, and also China and India starting to have trade relations with Iran, or at least talks about it, a lot can change, and we're at the Pluto return cycle. It's the end of the empire, as I've talked about before.
When it hits that degree of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and that's really interesting. That the thing to keep in mind, I think, now adds to the flavor of not only the Pluto return, but then it goes into Aquarius, and it triggers that degree of that conjunction, that 0 degrees Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Adding those degrees of those conjunctions, those major planetary conjunctions, to the transits, it adds to a lot of information. Anyone else? Anyone else? Comments?
Well, I would have. It seemed kind of irrelevant, but I do sometimes wonder about times when transiting planets replicate the natal aspects. Like, I was born with a Mercury-Pluto square, and one time, I don't know, I was kind of communicating with someone, and I was rather smart-assed with them over the internet during a Mercury-Pluto square. It didn't have anything to do with my own natal chart. There were no contacts, but it was just a replication of a natal aspect. That wasn't what she was talking about, though, so I didn't bring it up.
That reminds me, we had a speaker back I think it was 2010, earlier 2010, maybe 2009, that talked about those repeating aspects, those repeating, that no matter whether it was on your aspect, your exact aspect, but it was a repeat of that. Maybe it could have been Janet Booth, a repeat.
One astrologer who talked about that a lot was David Salte. I don't know where the idea originated, but you know, he was just validating what you were saying, Derek. Very much so.
Oh. Yeah, somebody brought that to my attention. I didn't even realize it at the time.
Well, that touches on a topic that I was sort of thinking about asking Georgia a question, but it's kind of one that if you're a halfway decent astrologer, you can figure out yourself, which is what of the various synodic cycles that she described should one really concentrate on if you're looking at your own chart. Now, obviously, you could look at all of them, but wouldn't it make sense to look at your chart and decide what planets, one planet or pair of planets or aspect is really significant? We kind of do this in basic astrology anyway, when we look at planets that are in their ruling sign or that have lots of aspects, or they're conjunct the ascendant, or they're the chart ruler, things like that. And so we can look at somebody's chart and say, oh, well, Venus is really strong in his chart, but Jupiter's kind of weak in her chart, things like that. Well, could you take that sort of an approach and then decide, well, I think that Saturn-Uranus synodic cycle is going to be tremendously important in my life, in the events in my life, whereas the Uranus-Pluto synodic cycle is not really that, you know, big of a deal because Pluto's not very well aspected in my chart and Uranus isn't very strong, or something like that. Would that make sense? I mean, I would kind of agree that any astrologer ought to be able to do this, but I've never really applied it with synodic cycles. So I thought about asking her what she would think about that. So what do you all think?
Cynthia, as you got your thumb up, you want to say something?
I just think that makes a lot of sense, Frank, because it's going to affect us more if it's related to our chart.
Yeah. I mean, we see transits anyway, where sometimes you have Saturn going stationary on your sun or something like that, and we go, oh, this is going to be a major event in my life, and then nothing really happens. And other times there's an aspect that you wouldn't really notice that much, but then that's the day that you win the lottery or get in a car wreck or, you know, something extreme like that. And you can usually figure this out if, like I just said, you look at your chart and try to figure out what planets, what aspects are particularly influential in your chart. But does it also apply to synodic cycles?
Right back. I'll be right back. You guys keep going.
It probably depends on if you're more interested in the historical context or if you're applying it to yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I thought I'd mention something with this Jupiter Neptune conjunction next year, which, you know, possibly is going to bring inflation, which we're already experiencing to a certain degree right now. In 2025, when Neptune goes into Aries, which is a fire sign, of course, whenever that has happened historically, we get really high inflation. That's what happened in the 1970s, late 70s, where we had 15% inflation. It happened after World War I. The Federal Reserve had pumped in a lot of money, and it resulted in the Roaring 20s. And also in Germany, you had the Weimar Republic, where you had such inflation that to buy some groceries, you'd have to bring a wheelbarrow full of currency. And at one point, somebody brought a whole wheelbarrow of currency to go buy just a single item, left it outside. And when he came back, all the money was there, but the wheelbarrow was gone because the $1 million in the wheelbarrow wasn't worth anything, but the wheelbarrow was. So, yeah, I'm really concerned in a couple of years going forward that everything may go out of control. I really do believe that the 4,000 cryptocurrencies that are out there are kind of taking a little bit of the pressure off of inflation, because the money's going into a black hole of cryptocurrencies, which may not be a black hole, but it removes money from being used to buy used cars or groceries or whatever, other commodities. I think that the inflation would be worse, but a lot of young kids got their stimulus checks and they're putting it into crypto versus, buying the next big computer or whatever. So this all remains to be seen. I've heard some financial pundits say that, well, we're probably going to go into a little bit of a deflationary couple years, but I don't see that happen, not with all the stimulus money and all the stimulus that's going into all sorts of things. So, who knows what's going to happen, but I am concerned about Neptune going into Aries, because that's when inflation does hit, when it goes into the fire sign.
So it seems like the rock bottom as recommendation over and over again is gold. By gold and silver. I mean, that's the one thing that, outside of real estate's people are paying so much. It's one friend that just called her. She was selling her place out in Sahuarita, and she had 5 or 6 offers in one day, and she sold to the person who offered her 25,000 more than she was asking.
Yeah, you could change that in a minute if you were to raise the rates 2%, 3%, because then people couldn't afford it. But right now, when you have, you can buy a home at an interest rate of 2.5% to 3.5%, your payments are so low that it makes sense to buy a place. When we had the Jimmy Carter era and the inflation was at 15%, the way Volcker, who was the Fed chairman, squashed it was he raised interest rates to 20%. And as a result, the inflation rate went from above 15% down to 4%, and then lower than that. So it's very easy. The Fed could turn off, prices going through the roof and prices of houses going through the roof just by raising interest rates. The problem when you do that is that the US government won't be able to afford to pay their debts at that point. You would have a default. We can pay our debts when, basically the Fed, our government's, our interest rates is almost zero right now. But if we had to pay a 5%, we could not sustain all of our debt. So that's the problem. So watch out for Neptune going into Aries. That's all I have to say. Yeah.
Well, when you think about what happened when Uranus went into Aries, it shook us all up so much. Watch out for Neptune going into Aries. Yeah, Frank.
I left the screen for a few minutes, so I had my off, but I didn't really have something that I wanted to say right now. But I will throw out a comment that came up during George's talk about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and the fact that there have been news reports that the FBI got back a lot of the ransomware that the pipeline company paid. And a lot of people said, oh, yeah, the government can hack into cryptocurrencies. You know, that shows they're not really safe. Well, I read a fascinating little article in an email newsletter. It actually is for investors, but it was talking about that because they were touching on the idea of investing in cryptocurrencies. And what actually happened is now this is the official story. We'll get to whether or not it's like some sort of conspiracy behind it. But the official story is the ransomware crooks, when they got paid in Bitcoin, they didn't move it, the Bitcoin, to some place that was really safe or immediately cash it out. They had it stashed in what is referred to as a soft wallet, which is to say a Bitcoin wallet that, you know, has all the blockchain that tells you got $5 million. But it's like on a server somewhere, and that server can be hacked or seized. Whereas if you download it to like a flash drive, then that's called a hard wallet, which is to say you've got it on this flash drive, and unless somebody like a mugger sticks you up in a dark alley and steals your flash drive and then goes home and puts it in his computer, you know, there's no way to get to it. But apparently the ransomware crooks left it in a soft wallet on a server, and the FBI did not literally hack Bitcoin. It was able to trace through internet tracking as to where the money had been sent. And guess what? It was on a server located in California. So the FBI got a warrant from a judge, and they went and they seized the physical server that had the actual computer in some server farm, the physical computer that had the Bitcoin loaded on it. So they basically took it away from the ransom crooks having access to it. But this is completely different from having some sort of Star Trek technology where you can hack a blockchain that's, you know, got millions of digits of encryptation or something like that. Now, the interesting thing, what I said earlier about maybe conspiracies and stuff, is the article said, we're going to presume that these people that are hacking a pipeline and can shut down the whole thing and then demand ransom, that they're sophisticated enough cyber criminals that they're going to know you shouldn't leave your $5 million in Bitcoin sitting in a soft wallet in a server somewhere. That it would have been more difficult if the server was in, you know, Abu Dhabi or Japan or China or something like that, but it was in California, for heaven's sakes. So you almost have to wonder, maybe the FBI or some other agency said, we need to discourage ransomware. So let's set up a deal where there's a big problem. We shut down a pipeline. They pay $5 million in Bitcoin, but the FBI is so smart that it comes and it gets the money back. Is that?
And it didn't shut down the pipeline. The president of the company did, or the CEO. They just hacked into the accounting department. It was the guy who owned the company who decided to shut down the pipeline. So there's a lot of there could be a lot of questions that could be asked of what was really going on.
Anyway, that's kind of a long description, and I didn't want to interrupt Georgia's excellent talk about all the astrology stuff by interjecting that there seems to be more to the story of the FBI managed to
Yeah.
get back the money.
There always is. So everybody, I think we're all kind of just fading away here. Probably have something else to do. It's been nice chatting with you all. Always is, always is. We'll have
So,
fun in July.
I'll
Okay.
stop recording now, Tom.
Oh, you could have stopped a long time ago.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's great. No, I think I'm going to keep our end discussion here because Dale had so much that was interesting. I think we'll include that in our video as well as other people, what Frank said, etc.
my description of the FBI getting Bitcoin back is maybe not all that relevant. I know that Tom, Eric, and Gail would be interested in that, but certainly we can include a lot of the discussion after Georgia left us, though, that's all about astrology.
If I may, I request that Frank's comments are included. I think that with this current Mercury retrograde and the solar eclipse conjunct the Mercury retrograde, and both of them square Neptune, I really hope that Frank's comments stay on this. So thank you, Frank.
Okay.
All right. Okay, everybody.
Right.
Is it a wrap?
Yep.
Love you all.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Gail.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day, all.
Thank you.
Hi, Morgan.
Thank you.